The rain began as a light drizzle when the sleek black car, polished like a cut diamond, glided to a stop behind an endless line of brake lights. Raindrops danced across the tinted glass and carved meandering trails that disappeared, a melancholy ballet that mirrored the heavy mood of the afternoon. In the back seat, Adeline remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the world outside, unfolding beyond her armored bubble. A powerful 50-year-old executive used to signing million-dollar contracts and deciding the fate of hundreds with a single phone call, she was now trapped, paralyzed in a sluggish traffic jam inside her own rolling fortress. At the wheel, Arthur kept a steady grip on the wheel. His face was lined by his 60 years, yet his eyes remained sharp and discreet. He'd only been her driver for a few weeks after nearly 4 decades ferrying high-strung CEOs who barely acknowledged his presence. Adeline was no different, polite but distant, treating him like a well-oiled cog in her relentless schedule. No personal connection, no warmth. Suddenly, the overcast sky cracked with a roar of thunder that made even the most seasoned drivers tense. Sheets of rain began lashing against the windshield, creating a blurred, shifting curtain across the cityscape. On the sidewalks, pedestrians rushed for cover, a frantic scramble as they tried to escape the storm's fury. The world outside felt harsh and indifferent. And then they saw them. Across the street, under the merciless downpour, a young woman, hardly past 30, struggled to shelter a little boy. The child, maybe 2 years old, was shivering and crying, his face red and wet with tears and rain. Desperate, the mother bent to snatch a crumpled piece of cardboard from the sidewalk and held it over his tiny body in a tender, instinctive gesture. For a fleeting second, Adeline caught the woman's eyes meeting hers, a silent plea, before a shopkeeper brusquely swung the front door shut with a metallic clang, leaving them to fend for themselves. "It's heartbreaking, what some people have to go through," Adeline murmured, mostly to herself, feeling a strange ache she couldn't quite name. For a moment, she thought just acknowledging that pain was enough to ease her conscience, as if recognizing someone's suffering was an adequate substitute for humanity. But there's not much we can do. It's impossible to help everyone like that. Arthur stayed silent. In the rearview mirror, his face was tense, contemplative. Her words hung between them like a weight in the rain-thick air. "Miss Adeline," his voice was low, hesitant. "Yes," she replied, sensing something different in his tone. He took a long breath, hands tightening around the wheel as if making up his mind. "Ma'am," he continued, firmer this time, his voice carrying a quiet dignity she'd never heard before. "I know this might cost me my job, but I can't see that and do nothing. I'm sorry." Before Adeline could respond, he eased his foot off the brake and steered onto the curb. Instinctively, she grabbed the back of the seat. "Arthur? What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice tinged with a mix of surprise and annoyance. "We're already behind schedule." But he was no longer listening. Without hesitation, he unclipped his seatbelt, threw open the door, and stepped into the rain. Instantly, it soaked his suit, plastering it to him as he hurried across the sidewalk, ignoring the startled glances of passers-by. Reaching the young mother, he peeled off his jacket and held it over her and her boy, shielding them from the downpour with a gentle care that contradicted his sturdy appearance. Adeline watched in disbelief, her heartbeat quickening in a way it hadn't in years. Time seemed to stretch as Arthur led the mother and her son back to the car. Opening the front passenger door, he gestured for them to get in. The woman hesitated, scared and uncertain, but the little boy reached out toward the warmth and light spilling from the interior. Without a word, Arthur settled them into the seat, careful and respectful. By the time he returned to the wheel, avoiding Adeline's gaze, the leather was wet and streaked with muddy footprints and rainwater. He braced himself for the fallout, a reprimand, a dismissal. Almost 40 years of loyalty to the company could vanish with a single phone call. Yet, strangely, he felt at peace. Adeline sat frozen in the back seat, her eyes fixed on him through the mirror. Words failed her. Outside, the storm raged even harder, but inside, a different kind of storm was breaking, one stirring long-forgotten feelings deep within her. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Arthur murmured, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I couldn't just leave them there." Their eyes met for a fleeting second. His gaze was tired, weathered, yet unwavering. And for once, she had nothing to say. As the rain battered the windshield and headlights sliced through the deepening gloom, Adeline took it all in, the trembling boy with tear-streaked cheeks, the mother who barely dared to breathe, the soaked jacket discarded on the seat. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The city lights shimmered and blurred through the raindrops sliding down the car windows. Adeline sat in silence in the back seat, lost in her thoughts. She kept her gaze off the rearview mirror, avoiding the new reality that had just crashed into her world. A few feet away, in the front seat, the woman and the child Arthur had pulled from the rain sat huddled together, as if they were scared to take up too much space. "What's your name?" Arthur asked softly, breaking the tense quiet. The woman slowly turned her face toward him, her eyes blank and distant, as if it took effort to remember her own voice. "Marjorie," she whispered. The little boy was curled against her chest, soaked and trembling, his hair plastered to his forehead. Arthur paused before asking, "Do you want me to take you home, Marjorie?" His voice was careful, gentle. A long silence followed. Marjorie stared out at the street, lost between the glowing red of the taillights and the darkness around them. "I don't have a home," she finally answered. The car felt smaller in that instant, as if her words had sucked the air right out of it. Even the rain outside seemed to grow quieter. Adeline heard every word, but she stayed perfectly still, saying nothing. She only turned her face to the glass, where her tense, unreadable expression stared back at her. Arthur took a deep breath before leaning toward Marjorie again. "Then come with me," he said calmly, his voice steady. "My wife and I live alone. Our kids are grown and only visit on weekends. We have a spare room. You and your son can stay until you get back on your feet." For a moment, Marjorie just looked at him, fear and disbelief warring in her expression, as if it were too much to accept. But the cold that crept in through the doors and the boy shivering against her chest spoke louder than her pride. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. A tiny nod was all Arthur needed to know she'd agreed. The car pulled back into traffic. The mood had shifted slightly, though the air was still charged with emotions none of them could put into words. When they finally stopped at the gleaming downtown tower, Arthur stepped out and held the door as Adeline climbed from the back seat. Without a word, she slipped into a quiet elevator and disappeared behind mirrored doors. For a second he stood there in the drizzle, the scent of rain clinging to his damp suit that now covered Marjorie's child. Then, without hesitation, Arthur slid back into the driver's seat and pulled away. He knew it would be hours before Adeline was ready to go home. That gave him plenty of time to do the right thing. His heart thudded in his chest like never before. When he reached the small, cozy house he shared with his wife, Louise hurried to the door, worry written all over her face. Her eyes immediately took in Marjorie and the exhausted child, dripping rainwater onto the floor. Without waiting for explanations, Louise broke into a kind smile. "Come in," she said warmly, reaching out a hand. "Here's a clean towel. Let's dry you off, and I'll find some warm clothes for you both." As the little boy dozed on the couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, Arthur and Louise exchanged a look that said more than words ever could. They didn't need long discussions to know they'd done the right thing. In the corner of the room, Marjorie sat like a wounded bird. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No need to thank us," Arthur replied with a gentle smile. "You can stay as long as you need." A few hours later, back in the company garage downtown, Arthur parked and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel. Adeline would probably be finishing her meeting any time now. A few minutes later, he watched her emerge from the elevator, face blank, steps quick. As she settled into the back seat, he took a breath and spoke up carefully. "Ms. Adeline," he began, "I just want to say I'm sorry for making you wait earlier. I acted without your permission. I know I could lose my job over this." Adeline didn't answer right away. Outside the window, rainwater glistened under streetlights as the last of the storm moved off. Her face was unreadable, a mixture of emotions Arthur couldn't place. "I understand," he went on, voice quiet. "And if you need me to quit, I'll accept that. I just couldn't leave them there." They glided through the rain-slick streets in silence until they pulled up at her house. Arthur braced himself for the worst, for her to say he was fired. But just as she reached for the door, she paused and looked back at him. "Have you learned anything about her?" she asked, her voice calm but not cold. Arthur blinked in surprise. "Not much," he replied honestly. "Her name's Marjorie. She told me she doesn't have a place to live. Beyond that, we hardly talked. But my wife took her in, and they'll stay with us tonight. Maybe a bit longer." Adeline hesitated, something softer in her expression, as if a crack had appeared in the polished, distant woman she usually was. "Tomorrow," she said at last, "I'd like you to bring her by. I want to speak to her myself. Maybe we can see if there's something for her at the company." Arthur felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Of course, ma'am," he replied. "I'll take care of it." When he got home that night, everything felt lighter. In the cozy house, the boy was asleep on the couch, wrapped up and warm. Marjorie sat at the kitchen table with Louise, the two women speaking in low tones. Gone was the fear that had once clung to her like a shadow, though exhaustion still showed on her face. Seeing Arthur, she stood up slowly. "Your boss wants to see me tomorrow," she whispered, barely daring to believe it. "And she thinks there might be a job?" He nodded with a small, tired smile. "That's right. Get some rest, we'll talk more in the morning." And so they settled in for the night, sharing a few gentle words before the house finally grew quiet. Outside, the rain had moved on, leaving behind a deep, steady peace. Even though they all knew the road ahead was long and uncertain, one thing was clear as morning light breaking through a storm: somewhere between pain and new beginnings, a fragile hope had taken root. The morning was gray, as if the city itself could sense that something invisible and heavy was hanging in the air. Arthur adjusted the rearview mirror calmly, even though, deep inside, a strange, restless feeling had taken hold of him. Beside him, Marjorie kept her gaze lowered and hands folded in her lap, as if awaiting a verdict that had never been spoken aloud. They moved through downtown streets, surrounded by glass and concrete towers that loomed overhead, staring back at everyone with cold indifference. When they pulled up in front of the imposing office building where Adeline's company was headquartered, Marjorie paused, staring up at the facade like someone facing an unscalable wall. "Are you ready?" Arthur asked softly. "I think so," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He led her through the wide, quiet hallways to the president's office. The sound of their footsteps on the carpet was muted, yet thunderous in Marjorie's ears as her heart thudded in her chest. When the assistant gave a small nod, the door swung open. Adeline was waiting, seated behind a sleek darkwood desk, her expression serious yet attentive. She gestured for Marjorie to come in and take a seat. "Good morning," Adeline greeted her, trying to strike a balance between authority and warmth. "Good morning," Marjorie answered, her voice trembling. The air between them grew dense. Marjorie felt the sharp gaze of this powerful woman who, until yesterday, had seemed distant and unreachable. And then her eyes drifted to a silver picture frame perched on the corner of the desk, a photograph that froze a moment Marjorie could never erase. In the picture, Adeline was smiling, her arm wrapped around her husband, Ronald, in a way that spoke of intimacy and devotion. The ground seemed to disappear beneath Marjorie's feet. In an instant, the office faded, and all that remained was a surge of pain long buried but never forgotten. Without thinking, she stood up abruptly. "I appreciate your time," she managed in a voice that felt like it was breaking. "But I can't accept the job." Before Adeline could respond, Marjorie hurried out of the room, leaving Adeline speechless and her assistant equally stunned. Alone in her chair, Adeline stared at the empty seat across from her, a knot tightening in her throat. She had no idea what had just happened. What had gone so wrong? "Get Arthur," she instructed at last, her voice quieter, less sure. Minutes later, Arthur appeared at the door. "She left already, Ms. Adeline," he told her, reading the concern in her face. "Something must have upset her," Adeline said, leaning forward. "Do you know what it was?" "No, ma'am," Arthur replied honestly. "She walked in and walked out like she'd seen a ghost." Adeline sighed, hands clasped on the desk. "Find out what happened," she said, this time without her usual stern tone. And make sure she gets home safely." Arthur nodded and hurried off, determined to get to the bottom of this. He ordered a ride for Marjorie, who was waiting quietly in a corner of the lobby, face pale and eyes distant. "Why did you leave like that?" Arthur asked carefully, trying to hide his own confusion. Marjorie just shook her head, a quick, guarded motion. "I don't want to talk about it," she said, her voice so low it was almost a breath. Arthur didn't press. Something deeper was going on, and something painful that she wasn't ready to share. For now, all he could do was make sure she got home safe. That night, back at the modest, welcoming house he shared with his wife, Louise, Arthur watched Marjorie return after a long day of knocking on doors and handing out crumpled resumes, only to come up empty-handed. The exhaustion in her face and the slump of her shoulders told the story before she could say a word. Still, as she crossed the threshold into the warm light of the home, she gave a small nod and forced a fragile smile. "As soon as I land something," she said softly, "I'll find a daycare for my son. I don't want to burden Louise." In the kitchen, Louise caught her words and spoke up with a warmth that filled the room. "Having him here brings me joy," she assured. "Take your time." Those simple words reached Marjorie in a way nothing had for a long while. She glanced away, unable to hide the mix of gratitude and guilt that had taken root inside her. And so the day ended in a gentle, comforting quiet. From the corner of the kitchen, Arthur and Louise exchanged a knowing look as Marjorie disappeared into the guest room for the night. They understood that the mystery wasn't solved, not yet. But they also knew that, in the midst of pain and secrets, invisible bonds were starting to grow. Threads of compassion and hope were weaving their way into the fabric of their lives, stitching together a future none of them had seen coming. The next morning, the sky broke into a pale mix of blue and gray, as if the city itself couldn't decide between hope and the weight of reality. Adeline arrived at the office early, feeling a strange unease she couldn't quite put into words. The image of Marjorie's shocked face when she saw the framed photo kept playing on a loop in her mind, stirring up a sharp, unfamiliar ache in her chest. She had hardly settled into her chair when the door eased open and Arthur appeared, as discreet as always. "Miss Adeline," he said respectfully, "I managed to get her full name." "Marjorie Ellis." Adeline reached for the piece of paper as if it were a crucial clue, something that might explain the tension hanging in the air. She glanced up at Arthur and nodded. "Thanks, Arthur. I need to figure out what happened to her," she replied quietly. As soon as he left, she picked up the phone and dialed the one person she trusted to dig deeper with absolute discretion. "Jake," she began the moment he answered, "I need you to look into someone named Marjorie Ellis. Check her work history, especially at our company. Take as long as you need, I want to know everything." Jake kept it short and assured her he'd get started right away before hanging up. Adeline sat back in her chair, eyes drifting to her desk. That silver picture frame still held the image that had unsettled everything. She picked it up, tracing her thumb along the glass. There they were, her and Ronald, in one of those perfect moments she thought would last forever. What had Marjorie seen in this picture that hit her like a ghost from the past? What had Ronald been hiding? Hours slipped by, and by the time a warm amber glow began spilling across her office, the phone rang again. It was Jake. "Ms. Adeline," his voice was calm and measured. "I dug up some information. Marjorie Ellis worked for the company about 3 years ago. She was at Division 2. Adeline felt her heart skip a beat. "Division 2, she echoed, her voice suddenly tight. "That's right," Jake continued. "That's the branch Mr. Ronald oversees. She was fired for cause." A chill ran up her spine. Adeline could hardly believe what she was hearing. Ronald was known for his patience and integrity. Everyone loved him. A respected leader who ran meetings with grace, listened to his team, and earned their loyalty. It was impossible to imagine him being unfair to anyone. "Did you find out why she was let go?" she asked, a knot forming in her stomach. Officially, Jake replied, they accused her of embezzling company funds. "But there are some holes in the paperwork, things that don't quite add up." Adeline went quiet, the silence stretching between them. "Keep going," she said at last. "I want you to go deeper than the official records. Talk to former employees, check past reports, security footage, whatever you can." "Consider it done," Jake replied, and the line went dead. Adeline leaned back in her chair and shut her eyes. If Marjorie was a thief who'd stolen from the company, why had Ronald never even mentioned her? Adeline tried to remember the last time she'd visited Division 2. Vague flashes of bright offices, polite smiles, and glowing reports floated up in her memory. Ronald had always been so kind and supportive. Thoughtful. The sort of husband who would come home early to make dinner when she was having a rough day. Gentle and funny, with a way of making her laugh when the stress was too much. No one had ever whispered a word against him. But now, with Marjorie's quiet shadow lingering in the back of her thoughts, Adeline began to see him in a different light. Meanwhile, back at Arthur and Louise's house, Marjorie felt like she was walking a thin line between relief and fear. The day had been long hours spent knocking on doors and filling out applications, facing polite smiles and empty promises. When she finally returned that evening, Louise greeted her at the door with a kind smile and a hot meal. Marjorie's son was already asleep on the couch, tucked under a cozy blanket that smelled faintly of lavender detergent. "No need to rush," Louise said sweetly, and the gentle warmth in her voice almost broke Marjorie's resolve. And yet, beneath that calm exterior, fear gnawed at Marjorie like an old wound. She knew this quiet life couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the past she carried would catch up to her. That night, Adeline stared out at the city, its millions of tiny lights flickering like scattered thoughts across the dark skyline. For the first time, she felt strangely detached from her home, from her own story. It was as if a small, persistent voice had begun to call her, whispering that there was another version of the past she thought she knew. Her decision was made. "Tomorrow," she whispered into the empty room. "I need to know the truth." And when morning came, the secrets lurking in the dark would finally begin to come to light. The pre-dawn breeze moved softly through the curtains of the spacious suite, making them sway in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Outside, the city slept in an almost surreal quiet, broken only by the occasional sound of a car speeding past or the distant wail of a siren. But in that room, the world felt far away. Adeline lay still in the dark, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if searching for answers she'd never managed to find. All day long, her past had followed her like a shadow, pulling her into a maze of memories she rarely dared to visit. Her mind drifted back to when she first met Ronald in college, back when they felt invincible, full of dreams and endless possibilities. She had come from an affluent family, and so had he. Their meeting had been almost scripted, like a future already decided long before they ever crossed paths, exactly what their parents had always hoped for. Her father's face crossed her thoughts. Leopold. A man who never showed affection and barely had time to sit down at the dinner table with his own daughter. Still, he shaped every part of who Adeline would become. A respected tycoon in the shoe industry, he'd turned a small family business into a global empire and then slipped away just after walking her down the aisle, as if that had been his only purpose. Hers had been a childhood built on short commands, stern glances, and unspoken respect. The word love was never part of their vocabulary. And her mother, gone too soon for Adeline to even remember the sound of her voice. It was Ronald, the kind and driven, who held her together when the weight of her father's death struck like lightning. It was him who encouraged her to take the reins of the family business, who stood by her as she learned to chair meetings and navigate boardrooms that felt like rough seas. And when she faltered, he'd step in naturally, as if preparing her for the day she'd do it all on her own. It was through those early years that Ronald took over Division 2, the branch that specialized in overseas exports, a vital part of the empire Leopold had built. Adeline's lips parted in a tired sigh. The house was never filled with laughter and kids running up and down the halls. They'd taken years before deciding to have a child, like they were waiting for the perfect moment that never quite came. Isabel was born when Adeline was already in her mid-30s, a planned and long-wanted baby who somehow still inherited this strange emotional legacy that ran through the house like a secret. Adeline loved her daughter deeply, yet she had never been able to show her that messy, uninhibited kind of affection she had seen other mothers give so naturally. Even though her love was real, it felt filtered through an invisible wall. And so Isabel had grown up accustomed to seeing her parents come and go, shuttling between trips, meetings, and responsibilities. By the time she was 15, she was used to more screen time than FaceTime, drawing her comfort from friendships on the internet more often than from home. A knot tightened in Adeline's chest. She had promised herself that her daughter wouldn't grow up feeling the same emptiness she had. So why had she let history repeat itself? Why had she made the same mistakes that had hurt her as a child? Maybe because she'd never learned to love the way she wanted. Or maybe because she thought that as long as the house was beautiful, the bills were paid, and their status was intact, everything else would work itself out. And what about her marriage? Adeline shifted under the covers, tugging them up to her chin. She and Ronald had always gotten along, or at least that's what she believed. They had built a partnership that felt steady and kind, never stormy, but never fiery, either. There was mutual respect between them, and a quiet gentleness that kept things working. She admired his intelligence and composure. He, in turn, treated her with a subtle tenderness that made her feel safe when she let her guard down. Still, looking back, she could see there had never been much space for big, bold gestures, the kind of grand romance other couples nurtured. Once, they took trips together twice a year to far-off places, savoring those shared discoveries like a ritual. But that was before work swallowed up every bit of free time, before the office became his sanctuary instead of a mere duty. In the past 6 years, they hadn't traveled together once. They'd both gotten so tangled up in their own routines that the absence of those trips hardly registered anymore. They never discussed the why, never acknowledged the slow shift between them. Adeline had never even thought to ask. And as she lay there, the thought pressed on her chest like a weight: how had she never noticed that Ronald hadn't even told her about a serious employee issue at Division 2? Someone fired for embezzling company money, and yet not a word passed between them. How had she missed those silences between them that ran deeper than she realized? Adeline let another long breath slip through her lips and closed her eyes, guilt stirring like a restless tide. For a fleeting moment, she wished she could go back and do it all over again, make different choices, speak the words she'd kept to herself, love the way she hadn't been able to before. But the present felt as solid and heavy as a stone, reminding her that all she had now were these memories drifting through her tired mind. That was when she heard the faint click of the front door downstairs. Soft footsteps patted across the polished floor, and then a familiar shadow stretched across the wall as Ronald slipped into the room. She caught a trace of his cologne as he set his jacket on the chair, heard the gentle creak of the mattress as he paused at her side and pressed a brief kiss to her cheek. "Long day," he murmured, voice low and tired. "I need a shower." Adeline didn't answer. She simply kept her eyes closed, holding her swirling thoughts inside. And so, caught in a quiet embrace of memories, unanswered questions, and the faint, warm presence of him nearby, she drifted off to sleep. Arthur and Louise's neat, cozy house had never been very lively after their kids grew up and started their own families. When the grandkids visited on Sundays, the place would light up again, rooms filled with laughter, squeals of joy, and the warm, sweet scent of cake baking in the oven. But as soon as they left, the house would grow quiet again, like a heavy curtain had dropped. That was, until Marjorie and Eric arrived. It was amazing how much light that quiet woman, her eyes full of gratitude, and the little boy who could barely speak had brought back into the house. Eric was only 2, quick to laugh, and just hearing those tiny giggles as he ran around could light up every corner of the house. Every time he'd come down the hallway, wobbly on his feet and reaching up for Louise with his chubby little arms, her heart just melted. "Come here, Grandma's little sweetheart," Louise would say, arms open to scoop him up. And he'd come toddling into her embrace, nestling his face into her chest and whispering that magic word: "Grandma." Each day that went by, Eric called her that as if it had always been true. Louise never had the heart to correct him. Instead, a deep, glowing warmth filled her up inside, so strong it brought tears to her eyes. She knew she'd never truly replace his real mother, but right then, she could be the grandma he had decided she was. While Eric spent his days spreading joy around the house, Marjorie was often out up before dawn, dressed neatly, gripping an old folder close to her chest as she hurried off to interviews and job leads all over the city. By late afternoon she'd come home tired but hopeful, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination that Louise was starting to recognize well. "How'd it go today, honey?" Louise would ask gently every time she heard Marjorie come in. At first, Marjorie would smile shyly and say the interview went fine. She'd plan for the next one, full of cautious optimism. But slowly, the pattern emerged: companies ghosting her, positions already filled, polite rejection emails. It was like some invisible force was keeping her on the sidelines. Still, Louise never let her feel defeated. "Their loss," she'd say warmly, putting a bowl of hot soup in front of Marjorie and patting her shoulder. "Tomorrow will be better." And Marjorie kept believing, because she had to. On the rare days when Marjorie stayed home, she'd talk with Louise for hours at the kitchen table, sharing bits of her past and listening to Louise's kind advice like someone leaning on an older sister. Every now and then she'd fire up Arthur's old laptop, the one he normally only used to balance the household budget and search for jobs outside the city. One evening, as the light of the sunset filtered in, she confessed her dream: to save up enough to move away, start over somewhere far, and give Eric a better childhood. Louise nodded, understanding perfectly. But every time she thought about Marjorie and Eric leaving one day, her chest felt a little tighter. And Eric? Eric was like a tiny sunbeam that never ran out of light. On Sundays, when Louise's grandkids came over, Eric fit right into their noisy games. They laughed and ran together, pulling him into their play as if he'd always been part of the gang. Louise loved hearing them call him by his name, loved seeing him jump into her lap when he needed a quick break, a drink of juice, or just to feel safe. And during the week, Eric followed Louise around like a tiny, devoted assistant. She'd show him how to water the garden plants, he'd grip the watering can with a serious look on his face that made her smile. She'd help him trace shapes in his picture books, the same ones Arthur had dug up from an old bookshelf. And when he was too tired to play, she'd hold him close, humming the soft tunes she used to sing to her own kids when they were small. In those quiet moments, her mind would drift back to her youth. She'd remember the day she first met Arthur at a picnic in a park full of wildflowers, the way he shyly asked her to be his girlfriend, and their modest wedding filled with music and joy. She'd remember their children as babies, the long nights spent rocking them, the sleepy cries followed by sleepy grins that always made her heart swell. The house had never really felt empty until they all grew up and moved away. And now, with Eric and Marjorie here, those memories came flooding back like they'd just been tucked away in a wooden chest. Louise was so grateful. Late on a warm Saturday afternoon, as the orange glow of the setting sun began to sink into the backyard, everyone gathered around a small table. Arthur had set up a cozy spot outside and covered the table with a bright, patterned tablecloth Louise pulled from the linen closet. On it, they'd laid out slices of homemade cake, a plate of cookies, a pitcher of cold juice, and a pot of fresh coffee. Louise pulled Eric onto her lap and chuckled as he reached for a cookie, his eyes bright and his hair tousled. Marjorie smiled shyly, serving herself a slice of cake, while Arthur pulled up a chair to join them. The air smelled like sugar and warmth. Nobody rushed to speak, they simply felt one another's presence like a comfort that eased wounds they hadn't even realized they had. And as the distant sound of birds settling into their nests mixed with the quiet murmur of gentle conversation and occasional laughter, Louise felt it deep in her heart. The house was a home again. The afternoon light filtered pale and hazy through the tall windows of the office as Jake rushed in, gripping a folder stuffed with papers against his chest. Adeline was already waiting, eyes fixed on some far-off point, her heart thudding with an anxious rhythm that wouldn't let her rest. "I found everything you asked for," Jake began, his voice measured, but loaded with implications. Adeline gestured for him to sit, leaning slightly forward. "You can start," she said. He took a breath, flipping the folder open as if unveiling some long-guarded secret. "Marjorie Ellis did work here," he confirmed. "She was hired in the finance department at Branch 2. For almost 2 years, every report she handed in was spotless. Everything balanced perfectly, accounts reconciled, cash flow strong. No one had reason to suspect a thing." Adeline felt a shiver, a mix of fear and morbid curiosity tightening her chest. "And then," she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "That's when they uncovered the embezzlement, Jake replied, his tone dropping as if the walls themselves were listening. For nearly a year and a half, Marjorie had been siphoning money from the company. It was always a small amount at a time, almost invisible, but those sums piled up over the months to something close to $2 million. She did it by tweaking the reports whenever she handled one of our Chinese contracts, claiming a lower value than what was actually signed and funneling the extra into her own account. Adeline felt like the air had been sucked from the room. $2 million. And Ronald, did he know? She asked, her voice trembling. He was the one who uncovered it, Jake replied, nodding slowly. Every termination document was signed by him. He decided to handle it internally and never involved the police. Letting her go with cause was one thing, but he kept the scandal quiet, probably to protect the company's reputation. If this had hit the press, it would have damaged the company's image. Adeline looked away, unable to ignore the knot twisting in her chest. She'd always trusted her husband's decisions, especially with business matters, but why had he kept this from her? Sure, protecting the company name was a sound business move. But why never mention it to her? And another troubling question began to nag at her: if Marjorie had stolen that much, how did she end up on the streets with a small child? She had $2 million, Adeline murmured to herself, as if hearing it aloud would make it more real. Why would she be living in poverty? Even if she'd spent it recklessly, it was impossible for all that money to simply vanish overnight. Something wasn't adding up. I want you to speak to some of her former co-workers, Adeline instructed, her voice steady now. Find people who actually knew her, get me their stories, their impressions. I need more than just numbers and reports. I want the truth. Jake nodded and left the room without a word. Still full of questions, Adeline grabbed her purse and headed to the car. Arthur was already waiting at the curb outside the office building, as calm and composed as ever. She slipped into the back seat, her thoughts swirling. As they pulled into the downtown traffic, she hesitated before speaking. Arthur, she began, her gaze fixed out the window. Yes, ma'am, he answered. Marjorie was fired because she embezzled money. $2 million, Adeline said, the weight of it pressing on every word. My husband discovered the whole thing before she was let go. The car went quiet, a silence so thick it felt like it had its own presence. Adeline could hear the shaky breath Arthur finally let out, a mix of surprise and disappointment. She stole from the company? Arthur asked, his voice hushed with disbelief. Adeline nodded. Yes. But before you jump to conclusions, I want you to listen to me, I'm still looking into this. Too many things don't make sense. I need you to help me, quietly. Don't do anything rash. Arthur's hands tightened on the wheel, his mouth a thin, tense line. Ma'am, he said after a moment, his voice heavy. That woman is living under my roof. She never told us anything like this. Please, Arthur. Wait. There's more to this story. Trust me. Arthur gave a stiff nod but didn't say much as he pulled up in front of the house. When he stepped out of the car, he paused for a moment at the gate, watching Louise play with Eric in the yard. The boy was chasing a butterfly, squealing with laughter. The sound of it tugged at Arthur's heart, but the weight of what he'd just learned settled like a stone in his chest. When Eric ran off to grab a toy, Arthur called Louise inside. We need to talk, he said, his voice grave. Louise looked up, puzzled, worry already clouding her eyes. Moments later, Marjorie appeared, sensing the tension. Arthur took a shaky breath, hands trembling slightly. Why didn't you ever tell us you were fired for stealing money, he blurted. Why hide the fact you embezzled from the company? The words hit Marjorie like a slap. Her eyes went wide, lips parting as if trying to draw breath. Arthur, she stammered, her voice breaking. You made us believe we could help you and your son, Arthur went on, pain and disbelief etched into every word. And all this time, you kept the truth from us. Louise's hands flew to her mouth, eyes welling up with tears. Tears slipped down Marjorie's face before she could stop them. I never wanted you to know, she whispered between sobs. I couldn't let you see me like that. Without another word, she turned, ran to the bedroom, and grabbed Eric, who looked up at her, frightened and confused. She held him close against her chest, bolted for the door, and rushed outside without a single backward glance. The door slammed with a hollow thud. Arthur stood frozen in the middle of the room, his chest tight with guilt, sadness, and a searing sense of betrayal. Louise sat trembling, crying into her hands, the aching emptiness between them filling every inch of the house. And somewhere far off, beyond the front gate and into the darkened streets, Marjorie disappeared into the night, Eric in her arms, while the city's shadows swallowed them whole and the full story of what had happened still waited to come to light. The house had never felt so suffocating. Night had settled heavily over the furniture Louise kept so spotless, as if even the walls were sharing the weight of the sadness in the air. She paced back and forth, eyes swollen, worry and anguish consuming her every thought. "How could you do this?" she snapped at Arthur the second he walked into the kitchen, exhausted from his long day and what he'd learned from Mrs. Adeline. Her voice, usually gentle and warm, now quivered with pain. "Adeline told us to wait, Arthur. She asked for patience, and you went straight to Marjorie with that story." Arthur lowered his gaze, unable to hold her eyes. "I wasn't thinking, Louise. I was furious," he muttered. "She kept all of this from us. And what Adeline told me was serious. How could we keep sharing a house with someone who stole that much money? Who never told us the truth?" Louise shook her head, tears streaming freely down her face. "You didn't even give her a chance to explain. Marjorie never treated us badly. She and Eric were like a ray of light in this house. Didn't you see the way Eric called you Grandpa? The way she looked at us like family? How could someone like that do what they're accusing her of?" She paused to catch her breath, trying to keep her emotions under control. "I believe in her. I believe there's more to this story. And most of all, I believe she has nowhere to go. You need to find her, Arthur. They must be scared and all alone somewhere. Please, do this for me. For them." Arthur exhaled slowly, the weight of his decisions sinking deep into his shoulders. "I also believe there's something we don't know," he murmured. "But what if we really did let a criminal into our house?" Louise, however, wasn't backing down. Her face, tear-streaked but determined, showed a strength Arthur rarely saw. "Then let's figure it out together. But until then, promise me you'll go after her. She and that boy don't deserve to sleep on the streets." Arthur nodded wordlessly, grabbed his keys, and stepped back into the cold night that was already wrapping the city in its dark embrace. The streets felt endless. For 2 long hours, he drove every route he could remember, down every avenue, past parks and quiet corners. Every few blocks, he slowed his car, eyes scanning every shadow, hoping to catch a glimpse of Marjorie or Eric. Every face that wasn't theirs felt like another stab of regret. But there was no sign of them. When those 2 hours were up, Arthur pulled into the driveway with his heart as empty as the seat next to him. Louise was waiting by the door, her eyes full of a desperate question that Arthur could only answer with a silent shake of his head. "I'll try again first thing in the morning," he promised. And so he did. At dawn, before heading to work, he was already back on the road, driving slowly as the city began to stir. The sky was streaked with orange when he passed by a park crowded with homeless men and women sleeping under blankets or cardboard. Arthur searched every face, every makeshift shelter. Nothing. When he finally returned home, Louise was at the door, eyes red-rimmed and restless. She embraced him without a word, both feeling the weight of uncertainty crushing them. Meanwhile, high up in a sleek downtown office, Adeline sat perfectly still at her immaculate desk, listening carefully to the hurried voice on the phone. "Mrs. Adeline," Jake spoke with an edge of urgency. "I've tracked down a lead. The CEO of the Chinese company was here in the States just once. He stayed 2 nights at the Splendor Hotel. I spoke with the doorman. He told me a hotel driver picked him up personally and took him to the most exclusive restaurant in town. A place called La Couronne." Adeline held her breath. La Couronne was famous for its privacy, they never released customer information. Did you go there? She asked, hardly able to hide her eagerness. I did, replied Jake. But the manager wouldn't budge. Said it's their policy to never give out information, not even security footage. I offered what I could, but he didn't even blink. Adeline's hands clenched into fists on the desktop as a surge of frustration coursed through her. Listen, Jake, she answered, voice firm. His policy might change if the price is right. Tell him I'm willing to pay whatever it takes for a single image from that night. I just need one shot of Marjorie sitting with that Chinese executive. Nothing more. There was a brief pause before he replied. Of course, Mrs. Adeline. I'll do whatever it takes. When the call ended, Adeline closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything that was finally starting to take shape around her. She wouldn't rest until every last piece of this puzzle was in place. And as the warm glow of morning faded into the hustle and noise of the city outside, Adeline knew one thing for sure: the day was only just beginning, and the truth, however distant it had once seemed, was now closer than ever. The house had never felt so quiet. Ever since Arthur had left for work, the day dragged on slowly, as if even the clock was scared to move too fast. Louise wandered through the empty rooms, adjusting a knick-knack here, reorganizing a book there, trying to fill the vast, empty space that now felt bigger than ever. She already missed the sound of little Eric running between the chairs and Marjorie's gentle voice drifting into the kitchen just to ask a question or share a simple thought. That's when, just as she was about to put the kettle on the stove, the doorbell rang. Startled, Louise peeked through the curtains. For a second, her heart froze. Outside, Marjorie stood hesitantly, a small suitcase by her side and Eric perched on her hip. She looked tired, shoulders tense, like someone caught between running inside and turning away forever. Oh my God, Louise whispered, dropping everything and hurrying to the door. As soon as she opened it, Marjorie was wrapped in a tight embrace. Louise felt her fragile body stiffen for a moment before melting into her arms, as if clinging to someone she trusted, someone who felt like home. Come in, honey, Louise said, voice trembling. What happened? Why did you leave like that last time? Eric, recognizing Louise's face, squealed and reached for her with tiny hands. Grandma, he called, his words still soft and babyish. That simple word hit Louise like a wave of warmth. She barely held back her tears as she scooped him up, kissing his hair and holding him close. Marjorie, still in the center of the room, managed a sad smile. Her eyes glistened. I came to say goodbye, Marjorie murmured. I heard back from a company far away. Over 300 miles. They want me to start next week. Louise's heart sank. You're leaving already? Just like that? Marjorie nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. Yes. I couldn't go without thanking you. You and Arthur were the only people who reached out when I needed help. I'll never forget that. Eric fiddled with Louise's necklace, oblivious to the serious tone around him. Louise gently took Marjorie's hands in hers, searching for any sign that she might reconsider. Then why rush off like this, she asked. You can stay as long as you need. You have a home here with us. Don't you realize that? Marjorie hesitated, eyes darting to the ground, full of unspoken pain. The only sound in the house was her short, trembling breaths. I can't, she whispered finally. And I can't leave my address or phone number. It's better this way, for everyone. But Louise wasn't satisfied with that. She carefully set Eric on the floor, where he toddled off to play with a toy car in the corner, then stepped closer to Marjorie and held her hands more firmly. Marjorie, look at me, Louise said, her voice calm but resolute. Why all this fear? Why do you feel like you have to disappear? You never told me the full story. What happened at that company? Why were you really fired, and why did you leave so suddenly? I deserve to know the truth. Whatever it is. The question hung in the air like an invisible tether, impossible to ignore. Marjorie, who had held it together this whole time, finally let her walls crumble. Her hands flew up to her face as tears spilled through her fingers. "Louise, I never wanted it to come to this," she choked out between sobs. "You were the only one who made me feel human these past few months. You and Arthur opened your home, opened your hearts, and I never found a way to tell you just how much that meant to me." Her voice broke under the weight of years of fear, sadness, and guilt that had nowhere left to hide. Louise pulled her close again and guided her toward the sofa. Eric glanced up for a moment, curious, then resumed pushing his little car across the floor, blissfully unaware of the pain surrounding him. "You can tell me, Marjorie," Louise urged gently, like a mother to a frightened daughter. "You can cry as long as you need. You're not alone anymore. Whatever happened, I know there's a reason. I can feel the pain you're carrying." And with that, like a long-held secret finally breaking free into the light, Marjorie let the tears come deep, raw, and unstoppable. She began, voice trembling. "I never meant for any of this. I never wanted Eric to suffer. Never wanted him to live scared. But I never had a choice." Louise held her hands tighter, waiting as Marjorie searched for the strength to put it all into words. And as the soft afternoon light stretched across the living room floor, Marjorie felt, for the first time in a long while, that maybe, just maybe, this was the safe harbor where she could finally speak the things she'd never dared to say. And there, between tears and a fragile new sense of hope, the story that had consumed her for so long began to pour straight from her heart. The late afternoon sunlight filtered gently through the half-open blinds of the spacious office, glinting off the polished desk and the perfectly arranged picture frames that Adeline kept in pristine order. She was reading a report when two light knocks broke the silence. Her secretary appeared, hesitating. "Ms. Adeline, Jake is here," she announced. "He says it's urgent." Adeline looked up, intrigued. Jake was usually discreet and straight to the point. He never showed up unannounced without a serious reason. "Send him in," she replied, shifting in her chair. Jake stepped inside quickly, his expression tense, the kind of seriousness that instantly made Adeline's stomach twist. "Why didn't you just call me?" she asked, brow furrowing. He paused briefly, shutting the door behind him. "Because this time, ma'am," he replied, voice low, "I thought it was better to do this in person. It's something very serious." A heavy silence filled the room, like a thunderstorm just waiting to strike. "I found something you need to see," Jake continued, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his phone. "I managed to get access to the security footage at La Couronne, from the night the Chinese CEO was in town 3 years ago." Adeline's heart began to pound. "You mean you actually saw Marjorie with him? Is that what you're telling me?" she asked, leaning forward anxiously. Jake lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "No," he said, his voice so quiet it made Adeline's blood run cold. "She never showed up at his table." "What do you mean?" Adeline pressed, her brow tightening. "If it wasn't Marjorie, then who was with him?" Without a word, Jake turned the screen toward her. The grainy image showed the Chinese CEO seated at a tucked-away booth in a dim corner of the restaurant. The man's face was partly obscured by shadows, and next to him was someone Adeline never expected to see. Ronald. Her husband. Adeline froze, feeling like all the air had been pulled from the room. "Ronald," she whispered, hardly recognizing her own voice. "So, he was the one making the deal off the books?" The sting of the thought cut deep, her hands trembling as questions spiraled through her mind. "How could it be Ronald?" she murmured, mostly to herself. "Why would he never tell me?" Jake paused the video and took a cautious breath. "Ms. Adeline," he began gently, "there's one more thing." Her stomach knotted instantly. "What more?" she managed, her voice trembling. Jake hesitated again before continuing. "The restaurant manager agreed to show me a second clip, but only for a steep price. I paid him." Adeline stared at him, eyes glistening as though bracing for the worst. "Show me," she said. With a solemn nod, Jake flipped the phone around. This time, the footage showed a more private, secluded booth tucked deeper into the restaurant, and what Adeline saw shattered the last shred of her composure. There they were. Ronald and Marjorie. Her husband held Marjorie's hand as they spoke in hushed tones. Marjorie smiled at him, a different kind of smile, one Adeline had never seen before. Ronald brushed a strand of hair from her face, whispered something, and then, so gently it was painful to watch, he leaned in and kissed her. Adeline shut her eyes, feeling as though someone had knocked the wind out of her. The scene burned into her memory, every detail striking like a blade. Her chest felt tight, and hot tears welled up at the corners of her eyes. "I'm so sorry," Jake said quietly, his voice distant as if from far away. For long, aching seconds, Adeline stayed perfectly still, trying to find the strength to speak, but no words could make sense of the pain pressing down on her. Finally, moving as though in a trance, she rose slowly from her chair. "You can go, Jake," she whispered, her voice hardly audible. He hesitated for a heartbeat but respected her request and left the room in silence. As the door clicked shut, Adeline stood frozen for a long moment. The air felt dense, too heavy to breathe. She crossed to the window and leaned her forehead against the cool glass, tears spilling freely. The images kept replaying in her mind. Ronald, the man she had trusted all these years, revealed in a reality she never could have imagined. And Marjorie, the frightened young woman who'd shown up at her door one rainy day, now intertwined in secrets Adeline hadn't begun to understand. After several minutes that felt like hours, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and picked up the phone. "Arthur," she said when he answered, her voice trembling. "Please have the car ready. I want to go to the downtown branch." And before he could reply, she ended the call, grabbed her purse, and hurried from the office. The elevator descended in a hush, and Adeline caught her reflection in the polished metal walls. The eyes staring back at her looked like someone she barely recognized. Deep down, she knew nothing would ever be the same. When she crossed the lobby and stepped outside into the waiting car, the gray sky overhead felt heavier somehow, as if echoing the storm churning inside her. As the car pulled into the street and the city began to slip by, one thought consumed her: she had ignored the signs for far too long. And whatever waited at the end of this road, face to face with Ronald, would be the moment she uncovered the full, devastating truth. The only thing she knew for sure was that the veil over her life had finally been torn, and from this point on, nothing could hide the reality from her again. The car glided silently through the gray city streets, slicing through traffic like an arrow in the final stretch before hitting its mark. Adeline sat in the back seat with her hands clasped in her lap, her face turned toward the window, though her eyes didn't seem to see a thing, they were lost in her own pain. Behind the wheel, Arthur glanced at her in the rearview mirror, noticing the tears that rolled freely down her face. To him, they weren't just tears. They were pieces of her life shattering one by one against the reality that had just come crashing in. Ever since Adeline, between choked sobs, told him what she'd seen, the video of her husband and Marjorie, the kiss stolen in a dark, secluded corner, he hadn't known what to say. The only words that had come were a quiet, "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Adeline." And now, parked in front of the company's downtown branch, he could feel the weight of it all. Adeline didn't move. Her hands trembled, her gaze unfocused as if torn between opening the door and taking a step she never thought she'd have to take. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" Arthur asked carefully. "No," she whispered, barely audible. Then she took a deep breath. "I never thought I'd end up here." He simply nodded, understanding that sometimes silence offered more comfort than words. Just then, Arthur's phone buzzed. A notification lit up the screen, a message from Louise. Arthur frowned, his wife never texted at this hour unless it was urgent. Quickly, he opened it. The words sent a chill straight through him. "I just found out the truth about Marjorie. She and Eric are heading to the bus station. She's innocent. They're leaving. You need to go after them." Arthur read the message again, his heart pounding, then turned to Adeline. "Mrs. Adeline," he began in a low voice. "I just heard from Louise. She says Marjorie and the boy are running away. And that she's innocent." Adeline jerked her head up, eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. "What do you mean?" she asked, breathless. Arthur held out his phone so she could read the message for herself. When she finished, she didn't hesitate. "Go, Arthur," she ordered, her voice firm, a determination he hadn't heard in her for a long time. "Get us to the bus station. Right now." The drive felt like a blur, like a dream that moved too fast to hold on to. Adeline's thoughts raced as the city zipped by beyond the fogged windows. When they pulled up, they parked haphazardly and jumped out. The station was alive with the clatter of rolling suitcases, the loudspeaker announcing departures, people hurrying past like shadows. Nothing felt quite real. And then Arthur spotted them. "There they are," he called, pointing into the crowd. Marjorie and Eric were moving quickly toward the bus line. The little boy clung to his mother's hand, his tiny feet trying to keep up. "Marjorie!" Arthur's voice cut through the noise. She froze and spun around, eyes wide. For a second, it looked like she might run. Instinctively, she pulled Eric close, as if shielding him. "I can't," she said hurriedly, eyes glistening. "Please, I have to go." "Wait," Adeline urged, pushing through the crowd. At the sound of Adeline's voice, Marjorie stopped. Her tired, reddened eyes locked on Adeline's. Slowly, she shook her head, a silent plea to just let her leave. "Please," Adeline said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I just need you to tell me the truth." "Mrs. Adeline, I'm going to miss the bus," Marjorie replied, her voice barely audible over the noise of the terminal. Adeline reached out and took Marjorie's hand, gently, as though she might vanish if let go. "Then I'll pay for the next one," she said, voice thick with pleading. "You can go after you talk to me. Please." At that moment, Eric broke free from his mother's grip and reached for Arthur, who instinctively scooped him up. The boy nestled into his arms like he belonged there. Marjorie hesitated, then gave a small nod. The four of them moved to a quiet corner in a nearby cafe at the station, away from the rush of people. Adeline sat across from Marjorie, hands clasped together to keep them from trembling. "Marjorie," she began, voice trembling. "I need to know the truth. You and my husband, were you having an affair?" "And Eric," her voice caught, eyes glassing over. "Is he Ronald's son?" At the question, Marjorie visibly tensed. Her hands gripped the edge of the chair, knuckles white. She looked away, as if the weight of those words was too much to bear. And then, through a quiet, trembling sob that almost disappeared into the hum of the station, she finally spoke. "I'll tell you everything," Marjorie whispered. "But only if you promise to let me go after. I don't want anything from you or your family, just some peace." Adeline felt like the breath had been knocked out of her, like a knot was tightening around her chest. Arthur stood nearby, arms wrapped protectively around Eric, who was watching them with sleepy, innocent eyes. For a long moment, the world around them blurred, the distant announcements, the crowd of strangers in transit, all fading into the background. Here, in this fragile corner of the bus station, Marjorie's words hung between them like a sentence waiting to be handed down. And Adeline knew that, whatever came next, the truth was about to change everything. The words left Marjorie's lips in muffled sobs, as if her pain was shaping every syllable. She kept her gaze down, avoiding Adeline's eyes, while Adeline listened closely, tears streaming freely down her face for the first time in what felt like forever. "It all happened so fast," Marjorie began in a shaky, choked voice. "When I started at the company, I never thought it would end up like this." The noise of the bus station diner, hurried people, clinking silverware, seemed to vanish for Adeline, as though the whole world had narrowed to Marjorie's voice and the ache spreading through her own chest. "I was hired in the finance department at Branch 2, Marjorie continued, wiping her trembling hands across her face. "It was my dream job. But I felt so alone. I'd stay late, working on reports in that empty office long after everyone else had gone home. That's how I started seeing him more often." Adeline swallowed hard as the details dug deeper into wounds she hadn't even known were there. "Ronald," she whispered, voice barely audible. Marjorie nodded slowly. "He'd come by to check on the accounts. Always kind, always attentive, she paused with a trembling sigh. One night, after we'd stayed late finishing up some financial statements, he invited me out for dinner. I was tired and hungry and my guard was down, so I went. Arthur, who was holding Eric quietly in his arms at the end of the table, kept his gaze lowered. The boy was playing with a napkin, too little to understand the storm surrounding him. After that night, Marjorie went on, voice breaking as tears pooled in her eyes, everything changed. It was like I was living two different lives, the perfect employee who never missed a deadline and the woman caught up in something I never thought I'd be part of. Our relationship grew in secret, long nights at the office, stolen moments, whispered promises. Adeline felt her throat tighten. "You knew he was married," she said softly, more heartbroken than accusing. "I did," Marjorie replied, voice trembling. "And every day, it crushed me. But he kept saying he would come clean, that he couldn't live the lie anymore, that he loved me. And I believed him. I believed him so much that when I finally told him we had to end it, I thought he'd make that choice." A painful sob escaped Adeline. "Did he ever plan to leave me?" she asked, her voice almost too quiet to hear. "Yes," Marjorie whispered, face wet with tears. "That's what he kept promising. And for over a year, I held on to that promise." A heavy silence settled between them, a silence that felt like forever. Even the sounds of the bus station outside seemed to hold their breath. Then one day, Marjorie continued, voice trembling, "I found out what he was really up to." Adeline raised her head slowly, brow furrowed. "I uncovered the second set of books," Marjorie explained. "He had side deals, not just with the Chinese company, but with others too. Money was being moved around under the table while everyone thought the company was thriving. And people admired him for it." Arthur shifted his weight uncomfortably as the weight of Marjorie's words settled in the air. "When I confronted him," she choked, sobs rising up again, "he was furious. Said I'd never understand the pressure he was under. That if I told anyone, he'd destroy me." Adeline's hands were trembling against the tabletop. "So he framed you," she managed to say. Marjorie's answer was barely a whisper. "Yes. Every report had my name on it. He fired me for cause and told me he had proof that he'd never risk his reputation over a troublesome mistress." The words felt bitter, like they had scraped across her tongue. "I was ruined," she continued, eyes glassy. "No one believed me. Every door was shut the moment my name came up. And then I found out I was pregnant." Adeline covered her face with her hands, her body trembling. "Why didn't you ever come to me? Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was scared," Marjorie replied, voice trembling. "Scared of him and what he could do. I thought I could make it on my own. I lived off my savings as long as I could, hoping things would blow over. But my friends drifted away. Everyone thought I was a thief. And when the money ran out, I had nowhere left to go." As Marjorie spoke, Adeline could see it all, a woman left to raise a son alone, scraping by in a tiny, empty apartment, clinging to the last shred of hope as it slipped away. "I was scared he'd come after my son," Marjorie whispered, her voice so raw it broke the last of her strength. Adeline felt a surge of emotion she couldn't control. She reached across the table and took Marjorie's hand gently. Marjorie looked up then, eyes swollen and red but full of pain that had never seen the light. "I never wanted any of this," Marjorie said as the tears kept coming. "And he made sure the truth would never come out. That's why he destroyed me." And in that moment, Adeline understood the scale of the lie she had lived in for years, how her blind trust had allowed her husband to destroy another woman's life right under her nose. Here, in this noisy bus station, surrounded by strangers and the steady drone of arrivals and departures, the truth had finally surfaced. And with it came a reckoning that neither of them would ever forget. At the bus station, the tension between the four of them was so thick you could almost feel it. Adeline, still holding Marjorie's trembling hand, could feel the other woman's warmth mixed with the chill running up her own spine. She could see the fear in Marjorie's green eyes, could see the pain built up through countless days and nights spent surviving, not really living. Meanwhile, Eric, blissfully unaware of the heaviness in the air, tugged at his mother's pant leg, his chubby fingers gripping the fabric as if to say one simple thing: "I need you." "You can't just leave like this," Adeline finally spoke, her voice shaky but laced with a mix of strength and compassion. "You deserve a real chance to start over." Marjorie lowered her gaze to the floor, her face flushed with shame and sorrow. "After everything that happened, after what I did to you," she whispered, barely audible, "I don't know if I deserve that." Adeline took a deep breath and, in a surprising gesture, lifted Marjorie's chin gently with her fingers. "What's in the past is in the past," she replied. "I'm not going to let your future, or your son's future, be held hostage by mistakes and decisions that weren't entirely yours." Just then, as if life couldn't resist its timing, Adeline's phone buzzed. She let go of Marjorie's hand, pulled the phone from her pocket, and glanced at the screen. It was Jake. "Go ahead," she answered quickly. His voice crackled with urgency. "Adeline," he paused for a moment. "We just uncovered something else. There's a secret account in Switzerland under Ronald's name. $14 million. Adeline felt the color drain from her face, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath her feet. 14 million, she repeated in a near whisper, hardly able to process it. "Looks like he was moving way more money than we thought," Jake continued. "I'll get all the details together. I just thought you needed to know as soon as possible." Adeline blinked, trying to wrap her head around what she just heard. The situation was spiraling into something even bigger than she could have imagined. Every second, every new revelation, made it clear that the perfect life she thought she and Ronald had built was crumbling from the inside out. She ended the call and turned back to Marjorie, who was looking at her with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "There's a lot that needs to change," Adeline said, her voice steady and kind at the same time. "And that change starts right here. You're staying. You'll have a roof over your head, food on the table, whatever you and Eric need to rebuild your lives." Beside them, Arthur nodded, his face serious but his eyes glassy. "She stays with us," he added, stepping between the two women. "Louise is already attached to Eric. And honestly, so are we. You and your boy have brought light into our home, Marjorie. You deserve some peace." Adeline could see some of the weight Marjorie had been carrying begin to ease, if only a little. Marjorie let out a long, trembling sigh and looked at her son, who was tugging her hand with an innocent grin. "I don't even know how to thank you," she murmured. "After all the mistakes I made, after everything I put you through." Adeline gently raised a hand to stop her. "Let's not look back anymore," she said softly. "What matters is what we build going forward. You need to be okay so he can be okay too. And I want to help you do that." A tear slipped down Marjorie's cheek as she finally nodded. "Then I'll stay," she whispered, voice trembling like a promise. Arthur, who had been holding his breath without realizing it, finally exhaled and broke into a broad smile, lifting Eric into his arms. "Come on, buddy," he said warmly, drawing a giggle from the boy. As Adeline watched the scene, her heart felt tight. She knew that the road ahead would be long and full of obstacles. But there, surrounded by the noise of the bus station and wrapped in the unexpected warmth of this small moment, a fragile sense of hope began to take root. And as they walked toward the car, each lost in their own thoughts, Adeline let her gaze drift up to the orange-tinged sky. Deep down, she understood that what lay ahead would demand more strength and courage than ever before. But through the pain and uncertainty, a new story was starting to take shape, a future built on honesty, compassion, and a humanity they hadn't allowed themselves to believe in until now. Adeline had never been a hesitant woman. Throughout her life, from her college years all the way to running the company she'd inherited from her father, every move she'd made was driven by determination, careful planning, and an unyielding resolve. She always knew what she wanted and exactly how to get it. But tonight, standing in front of the Unit 2 office building, she felt like a stranger in her own skin. What she'd uncovered in the past 24 hours had shattered the image she'd held of Ronald, of their marriage, and of the life they'd built together. The ride home with Arthur behind the wheel was short, but every second felt like an eternity. Her thoughts kept drifting to Marjorie and Eric and to all those nights spent next to her husband, assuming the emotional distance was just part of a busy life, never imagining it was anything more. Beneath her composed expression, a storm was raging. When they finally reached home, Adeline dismissed Arthur and the other staff. The house was wrapped in a silence she'd never noticed before. She crossed the living room slowly, as if stepping into unknown territory. The weight of the night still pressed against her chest, but she knew she had to face whatever came next. As she walked past the hallway leading to the bedrooms, her gaze lingered on a framed photo of her daughter, smiling at 10 years old, arms wrapped around the dog that had been part of her childhood. A knot rose in her throat as she thought about that little girl who was now 15, gradually drifting away from her parents in a world full of emotional gaps. Without hesitating, Adeline paused outside her daughter's door and knocked softly. "Isabel?" Her voice was gentle, yet firm enough to make Isabel look up from where she sat on the bed, headphones still around her neck. When she saw her mother's face, Isabel's brow furrowed, sensing that something serious had happened. Adeline slipped inside the room, closed the door quietly behind her, and sat on the edge of the bed, something she hadn't done in a long time. "Isa," she began, feeling her eyes burn. "There's something I need to tell you." Isabel paused her music, lowered her headphones, and stared at her mother. The sanctuary of her room suddenly felt heavy, as though the air itself had changed. "Is everything okay, Mom?" Isabel's voice trembled between worry and fear. Adeline took a deep breath. Every word she needed to say felt weighted with the gravity of a world about to shift. "Your dad made some terrible choices," she finally said, her voice trembling. "Choices that hurt the company, hurt other people, and can't be undone." Isabel's eyes widened, sensing the seriousness of what was happening. "What do you mean? What did Dad do?" With a pain only a mother can feel when forced to watch her own child hurt, Adeline explained as carefully as she could. She told Isabel about the misappropriated funds, about the business deals Ronald had kept hidden, and most painfully, about the child he had with Marjorie. Adeline left out as many painful details as she could, but she couldn't hide the fact that there was a boy, Eric, who was part of their story too. Isabel began to cry, burying her face in her hands. "Why would he do that, Mom? Why?" Adeline reached out and pulled her daughter into a long overdue embrace, holding her close against her chest. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered. "I just know that he lost his way. And we lost a lot because of it." For a while, they stayed like that, two survivors clinging to each other like a lifeline in the dark. "Mom," Isabel choked between sobs, "what happens now? What's going to happen to us?" Adeline held her gaze, seeing her own guilt reflected in those tear-filled eyes. For too long she'd been so consumed by work, by what she thought was her duty, that she hadn't seen how much her own daughter had needed her. "Things are going to change, Isa," Adeline said firmly, brushing the tears from Isabel's cheeks. "And they're going to change for the better. Because tonight I realized that, for years, I failed you too. I was so busy with companies and meetings that I forgot what really matters, being here for you." Isabel nodded, gripping her mother's hand like a lifeline. "I'm so sorry for leaving you alone so many times," Adeline continued, her voice thick with emotion. "You deserve a mom who's really here. From now on, I will be." Tears welled up in Adeline's own eyes, a mix of pain and relief all at once. "But what about the company?" Isabel asked softly. "It'll go on," Adeline replied with a sad smile. "But differently. I'm going to build a team that can help me run the business. I'll delegate what I need to delegate, so I have more time for you, time to listen to you, help you, and be part of your world." Isabel nodded, squeezing her mother's hand a little tighter. "You'll see," Adeline whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. "This time will be different. You're going to come first. And don't worry, I know you're a teenager. You'll still have your freedom," she added, her lips twitching into a gentle smile. For a long moment, they stayed wrapped in each other's arms, as if making up for all the years they'd spent too far apart. The last rays of the afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, painting the room in a soft golden light like a gentle farewell to a long, painful day and the quiet beginning of a new one. A time when the bond between mother and daughter could grow again. Adeline knew the road ahead would have its challenges. But one thing was clear now: they would never face them alone. And with the promise of a new life shared between them, mother and daughter held on to each other until the night finally settled, its darkness blanketing the room like a quiet, comforting prayer. Adeline went to the bedroom. She changed into a simple, dark dress and took a deep breath. She would wait for Ronald right there. The house felt suffocating. Every object, every little detail that once comforted her now screamed with memories that hurt. She walked slowly down the hallway like a ghost searching for her own truth. It didn't take long before she heard him come home. The front door clicked open, followed by his heavy footsteps on the stairs, then the muted sound of his briefcase hitting its usual spot. "Adeline," he called. He found her in the bedroom, standing by the window. "Hi," she replied, her voice calm but icy, a tone he'd never heard before. Ronald walked toward her and reached out. "How was your day?" "Hard," she answered without looking at him. He paused, sensing something was off. "Is everything okay?" he asked, brow furrowing. Adeline slowly turned to face him, her gaze fixed and unyielding. "Marjorie." The color drained from Ronald's face. For a second, he looked like a man who had forgotten how to speak. "What about her?" he managed to say, but the words sounded like they belonged to someone far away. Adeline took a deep breath, feeling a fire in her chest. "You thought I'd never find out, didn't you?" she said, her voice trembling but controlled. "You thought you could steal from the company, cheat on me, destroy another woman's life, and then come home like nothing ever happened." Ronald opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "I know everything," Adeline continued, her hands trembling now. "About the affair, the money you siphoned off, the setup you pulled when Marjorie found out." "Adeline, wait. That's not true," he blurted, stepping toward her. "She had your baby," Adeline shot back, her words hitting like a whip. "And they were living on the street." A baby?" Adeline raised her hand to stop him. "I spent my whole life waiting, Ronald. Waiting for you to be the man I thought you were. Waiting for you to give me the loyalty I gave you." Her eyes glistened with tears. "And all I got was this emptiness so deep I'm not sure I'll ever forgive myself for being so blind." He shrank back as if every word was a punch. "I never meant for it to come to this," Ronald said, his voice almost pleading. "It was a mistake. A weakness that got out of control." Adeline let out a bitter laugh, one that felt more like pain. "A weakness that lasted a year, Ronald? That ruined a woman's reputation and dignity, a woman who never even exposed you? And on top of it, you stole from the company. $14 million in a Swiss account? Why?" She moved closer, tears streaming down her face. "You took more than my trust. You took a part of our history that we can never get back. And you took our company too. Why would you do that? Money was never a problem for you." He tried to take her hands, but Adeline stepped back. "Why?" she repeated, pain written across her face. Ronald looked away, ashamed. "Out of fear," he answered, his voice raw. "Fear of losing everything. The company, my name, you. And now," she whispered, voice nearly breaking. "Now that I know, what happens next?" He looked up, eyes red and tired. "I don't know. I never wanted it to end like this." Adeline stood frozen for a long moment. Finally, her voice broke the silence, quiet, final. "It already has, Ronald." The words hung between them like a heavy curtain that could never be pulled back. Then she turned and walked toward the door, each step sounding like an echo of a life they'd lost forever. He reached a hand out as if to call her back, but no words came. And as the house fell silent once again, Ronald was left alone, surrounded by the ruin he himself had created. In that moment, he understood with painful clarity that no apology, no plea, would ever bring her back. The early morning hours passed in silence inside the house that had once been filled with laughter and big plans for the future. Adeline hadn't slept at all. After the painful conversation the night before, emotions still churned inside her, and the weight of the decisions she'd have to make felt like it was crushing the air she breathed. As the pale morning light began slipping in through the curtains, Adeline stayed seated in the armchair by the window, her gaze fixed on some distant spot in the backyard. She knew this day would mark the definitive end of everything she'd built with Ronald over so many years, the company, the marriage, the very illusion that they'd had an honest relationship. A little after 6, she heard heavy footsteps in the hall. Ronald. She watched him pause in the doorway, hesitant, like a man about to face an invisible jury. His eyes were swollen and red, his face worn, like someone who hadn't slept a wink. "Adeline," he murmured, his voice hoarse, as though hoping for a chance to say what he'd never had the courage to say before. "You can speak," she replied, without turning her gaze from the window. He took 2 careful steps inside before stopping again, hands trembling at his sides. "I never thought this is how it would end for us," he whispered. "I never thought we'd come to this point either," she answered calmly, almost coldly. "And yet, here we are." A long silence filled the room, heavier than anything they could have said aloud. Adeline rose slowly from the chair and stood facing him, pain written all over her face. "You're going to give back what you stole," she said, voice steady. "Every last penny you embezzled from the company." Ronald swallowed hard, understanding there was no negotiating this. "And after that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "After that," Adeline replied, feeling her body tremble as she held herself together, "you leave." His face crumbled like brittle clay. "Leave," he echoed, as if trying to grasp the weight of his own guilt. "Leave," she confirmed. "The company, this house, my life." Her voice was controlled, but every word cut into her like a blade. Nothing would ever be the same. Ronald stared at the floor, shame and fear swirling across his face. "Are you going to report me?" he asked like a child fearing a punishment he couldn't take. Adeline answered without hesitation. "No. You'll return what you stole and disappear from our lives. That will be your one and only chance." He nodded slowly, defeated. The pain in the room was almost palpable. She had loved him once deeply, and despite everything, part of her would always remember the man he'd been when they first met. But the choices he made had shattered what they once had. Ronald took a deep breath. "I never wanted it to end like this," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Adeline didn't respond. She just held his gaze, eyes shimmering with unshed tears that now only reflected the end. Hours later, at the office they'd shared for years, Ronald signed the last paperwork authorizing the transfer of the $14 million he'd hidden away. Every signature felt like the final period in a story that could never be rewritten. Jake, Adeline's right-hand man, witnessed the scene in silence as he held the folder containing all the documents to return the money Ronald had siphoned into a distant offshore account. "Looks like we're all set," Jake said professionally, his tone flat. Ronald merely nodded. Words failed him. Adeline hadn't come, she needed the distance so the healing could begin, even if that wound would never fully close. While they completed the paperwork, morning light poured into the office, and Ronald felt the world around him, once so familiar, slipping forever out of his grasp. Later that day, when he finally returned home to pack a single suitcase with clothes and personal items, the emptiness hit him like a punch. No distant sound of Isabel's laughter, who had always been closer to her mom. He moved slowly through every room, lost in memories, their college years when they met, the plans they had made together when life felt simple. In the hallway, he paused at the door to Isabel's room and gave a soft knock. "Isabel?" She looked up from her bed, a book and her phone in her hands, brow furrowing as she caught the look on his face. "Dad?" she asked quietly, sitting up. He stepped in slowly, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "Isabel," his voice broke. "I came to say goodbye." Her eyes narrowed in confusion. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded slowly, feeling pain twist deep in his chest. "Just for a while," he said gently. "And I don't want you to think I'm abandoning you. You'll always be the most important person in my life." Isabel stared at her hands, nervously fidgeting with the edge of her comforter. Why, Dad? Why now? He took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of every choice pressing on him. Because I need to make things right inside myself, he answered, touching his chest. And once I'm stronger, once my head is clear, I promise I'll come back so we can really talk about everything. Isabel looked up, eyes glistening with fear and confusion. Do you promise you'll come see me? I promise, he said with a certainty that came from deep within. When I've gotten my life back together, I'll be here and we'll sit down and talk about everything. He knelt by her bedside and held her tight, feeling the familiar warmth of his daughter, the one constant that had kept him grounded through it all. Isabel hugged him back just as fiercely, like she could stretch this moment forever. I love you, he whispered into her hair. I love you too, Dad, she murmured, her voice trembling between pain and fragile hope. And so he left her room, closing the door gently behind him, knowing that this was only the end of one difficult chapter. One day, when time had done its work, he would come back to her again. He paused for a moment at the door to the bedroom he'd shared with Adeline and felt the true weight of what he'd lost: prestige, wealth, all of it meaningless compared to what was slipping through his fingers. Each step felt heavy as he walked toward the garage. He threw the suitcase into the trunk and sat for a moment, hands gripping the wheel as he stared up at the house. It had once been his home. It never would be again. In the silence, only the distant rustle of trees broke the morning hush, a quiet witness to the story that was ending here. He turned the key in the ignition and pulled away slowly, feeling more alone than he ever had in his life. And on that road stretching empty before him, there was nothing left but his own conscience and the heartbreaking knowledge that he had destroyed, with his own hands, what had mattered most. Arthur and Louise's house, once filled with the simple joy that Marjorie and Eric had brought, now felt wrapped in a tense silence. The morning sunlight filtered gently through the curtains when the doorbell rang. Louise glanced at Marjorie with a heavy heart, sensing that whoever was on the other side of the door was going to stir up emotions they weren't ready for. When Marjorie slowly opened the door, Eric hidden behind her legs, there was a long, breathless moment as she and Ronald faced each other without a word. Can we talk? Ronald finally asked, his voice trembling. Marjorie froze. The pain he represented was still raw, an open wound that had never truly begun to heal. But Louise, sensing the weight of the moment, gently touched Marjorie's shoulder and whispered, "You deserve to hear what he has to say." Taking a deep breath, Marjorie nodded and led Ronald outside to the small backyard. He followed her at a respectful distance. A light breeze tugged at the fallen leaves and made the flowers sway. Ronald stopped a few feet away, eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. Marjorie, he began, his voice scratchy. I never thought I'd find myself here like this. Standing in front of you, carrying all this guilt. She crossed her arms and looked away, heart pounding. Why did you come? She asked, her voice low but steady. Ronald paused, seeming to draw courage from each painful memory. I came because I never asked for your forgiveness. Because I never owned up to what I did or how much I hurt you. And now, with everything Adeline's discovered and everything that's come to light, I couldn't just leave without telling you. I'm sorry. His words hung between them. Marjorie blinked slowly, trying to process what she'd just heard. You ruined my life, Ronald, she finally answered, her voice trembling. You didn't just lie to me. You made me believe in a future that never existed. You tarnished my name and threw me out like I was nothing. I was left with nowhere to go, I was on the streets. He nodded, every word slicing into him deeper than the last. I know nothing I say can change that, Ronald murmured. And I deserve every bit of the hate you feel. But I need you to know that I never thought it would go this far. I never imagined there'd be a child I didn't even know I had. Marjorie's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away before they could spill. You never knew, she whispered, turning her face. I never deserved to, he replied, his honesty raw. Just then, Eric appeared in the doorway, quietly calling for his mom. Instinctively, Marjorie held out her hand to him. The boy hurried over, and Ronald stared at him, pain and awe flooding his gaze. "He's beautiful," Ronald murmured, almost to himself. Marjorie held Eric close, nodding silently. Then Ronald knelt so that he was eye level with the boy. "I know you don't understand this yet," he began softly, "but one day, when you want to know who I am, I'll be there. I won't force anything, I'll wait until you're ready. And I promise that when you do come looking for me, I'll be a different man. I can't erase what I did, but I'm going to spend my life trying to be better. Every person I've hurt, including you and your mom, deserved better from me. The hunger for power messed me up and took away everything good in my life. From this point on, my goal is to make amends." His words felt heavy, carrying the weight of everything that had been broken. Marjorie's chest felt tight. Part of her wanted to believe him, but the most important thing was keeping her son safe, writing their future without Ronald's shadow over it. "You weren't a father to him," she said, voice breaking. "And you may never be. So I'll hold on to this promise until he's old enough to understand it himself." Ronald gave a small nod. "That's fair," he whispered. He stood, brushing his eyes with his sleeve, and let out a long breath. "I also came to say goodbye," he continued. "I want you to have some peace. And I'll send money every month so you can give him the life he deserves." "I don't want anything from you," Marjorie replied firmly. "He has everything he needs right here." The boy, sensing the tension, held his mother even tighter. Marjorie nodded as Ronald gazed at them one last time. "There's a lot of healing left to do," he said quietly. "When the time is right, we'll talk again. Until then, take care of him." "Always," Marjorie answered, her voice a trembling whisper. And then, without another word, Ronald turned and walked away. As his car disappeared around the corner, Marjorie sat on the porch with Eric in her lap, the morning breeze brushing her cheeks and drying the tears that slid down her face. The road ahead would still hold plenty of unknowns, but this time, she would face them free from the weight that had followed her for far too long, and this time, she would build a future on her own terms. Arthur and Louise's house had never felt so full of warmth as it did that night. Outside, a gentle breeze hinted that the rainy season was finally drawing to a close. Inside, the soft yellow glow of the living room created a cozy atmosphere. The low hum of the TV blended with the quiet laughter coming from the fuzzy carpet where Eric sat, completely focused, a big bowl of freshly popped popcorn at his side. On the couch, Arthur and Louise exchanged tender looks as a colorful cartoon played on the screen. They never imagined that a tiny presence, a 2-year-old boy, would bring back what had been missing in their home for so long, the pure, easy joy that only childhood can inspire. Wrapped in a plaid throw, Marjorie chuckled softly at the character's silly antics. For a brief moment, she could almost forget all the difficult days, the sleepless nights, the fear that had kept her on edge. Right there, surrounded by them, she felt something she'd never dare say aloud, the gentle sense of truly belonging. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, breaking the quiet spell. Everyone paused, glancing toward the door. Who could that be at this hour? Louise wondered aloud, peeking through the curtains. On the porch stood Adeline, dressed with her usual polished elegance, but this time, there was someone at her side. A little girl held her hand, looking up curiously. It was Isabel. Arthur rose to answer the door, and Adeline's face lit up as soon as she saw them all together, so at ease. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "We were headed to the movies and thought we'd stop by real quick." "Of course not," Louise replied warmly. Come in, come in. We're just relaxing with some cartoons and popcorn." Isabel stared at the scene inside and, without waiting for her mom to say a word, let go of her hand and hurried over to Eric. "Hey," Isabel said, kneeling down next to him. "Can I have some popcorn?" Eric responded by holding the bowl out to her with a grin. Within moments they were giggling like old friends. Adeline stood in the doorway for a moment longer, eyes shimmering. The house gave off a gentle energy that pulled her in, a reminder of what had felt so out of reach for too long, the simple warmth of human connection. "Come, sit," Louise offered, gesturing to an empty spot on the couch. Adeline hesitated, then answered kindly, "Thanks. We won't stay too long." Isabel was really excited to meet Eric. As she spoke, Adeline's gaze found Marjorie, who had just looked up at the sound of her voice. The room seemed to go still for an instant, an unspoken understanding between the two women, one that no one else could fully grasp. Adeline took a breath, then, with a gentle smile, reached a hand toward Marjorie. "Actually," Adeline began, her voice steady but full of warmth, "I came here for more than a quick visit. I want you to know that I've been thinking a lot about you. And I'd like to invite you to be part of the new team I'm putting together to manage the company." Marjorie's eyes widened as a rush of emotion crossed her face. "Your team," she echoed softly, hardly believing it. Adeline nodded and pulled a crisp white card from her purse. "This is Jake's number," she explained. "He'll help you with all the details. Plus, we've set up a whole support system so you can restart your career on solid ground." Adeline paused, locking eyes with Marjorie. "You deserve this." Tears filled Marjorie's eyes as she slowly rose to her feet. Without thinking, she pulled Adeline into a heartfelt embrace. Adeline held her tight, an embrace long overdue, brimming with gratitude, forgiveness, and hope. "Thank you," Marjorie whispered. "You won't have to go through anything alone ever again," Adeline replied. Arthur watched the two women and felt a deep warmth in his chest. The Adeline he'd once known as distant and untouchable was nowhere to be seen. Here, now, was someone real, someone more human and approachable than he'd ever imagined. "Oh, and there's one more bit of good news," Adeline added, stepping back with a bright glimmer in her eyes. "We're launching a third unit at the company." "Really?" Arthur asked, impressed. "That's wonderful, more jobs for the city." Adeline smiled. "That's true, but this one's going to be a bit different. It won't just be an industrial facility. It's going to be a shelter for women and kids who need a safe place, with professional training programs so they can rebuild their lives. Plus, we'll have a daycare center. I've already approved the plans. And we'll use all the money that was in Ronald's offshore accounts to make sure that money goes to good use." "Oh my God," Louise exclaimed, thrilled. "That's such a beautiful idea." "Let's celebrate," Arthur suggested with a big grin. "Everyone's already here, why not stick around? Tomorrow's Sunday, and my kids will be over for a big barbecue. We'd love to have you." Adeline glanced over at Isabel, who was already happily stacking popcorn into a tower with Eric, laughing like they'd known each other forever. Then she looked back at Arthur, Louise, and Marjorie, feeling a quiet peace she hadn't felt in a long, long time. "I'd love that," she replied, her voice catching a bit. And so, surrounded by laughter, warm smiles, and the gentle murmur of the TV in the background, the evening passed peacefully. The house had never felt so full of friendship, of new beginnings, and most of all, full of hope. Outside, the moonlight silvered the quiet street, promising a future that felt a little lighter for everyone inside. Adeline knew there was still a lot to rebuild and many bridges to mend, but tonight, surrounded by these unlikely friends who welcomed her without judgment, she felt like she could finally breathe easy. And as laughter and the sound of small hands sharing popcorn filled the room, everyone knew that this was the start of a new story, a story filled with the one thing that can never be missing when love is present: hope.